lesson this week comes from 1 Samuel. And it's 1 through 12. It's the verses. I got a few things I want to read, and then later on in the lesson I wanted to kind of reiterate on something that happened to Karen and I when we was young people about thunder and lightning. It says leadership is essential for any group, be it a nation, a family, or a church. All groups have leaders, but the kind of leadership exercised in these groups is critical to their success. In recent years, many books have been written on leadership, covering various aspects of the subject in various contexts. Consequently, there are many definitions of leadership. Someone suggested that leadership is simply getting people to follow you. While that may be an accurate definition of the term in its broadest sense, it does not distinguish between good and bad leadership. Many leaders have been cruel and despotic, including some of the most infamous dictators in the history of the world. Regrettably, some religious leaders have acted similarly. Whether one considers ancient Israel or a modern nation, it is clear that both good and bad leaders greatly affect the people they rule. I got one more over here. It says, we are all families with, or all familiar families. Excuse me. We are all familiar with the phrase, God bless America. Politicians as well as preachers say it. In fact, it is one of the trademark sayings of patriotism, but what does it take for a nation to be blessed by God? It is certainly not perfection, because no one is perfect. However, Psalms 33:12 says, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, and the people whom he hath chosen for his own inheritance. A nation that worships the Lord will be blessed. The nation that pulls away from God or outright rejects him invites his wrath. Political leaders who treat God as though he is irrelevant or unfit for the public arena are putting themselves and the people they govern on the perilous road. This week we will see how a proper view of God can lead to national revival and prosperity. Now that brought up something that I seen this week on YouTube. The governor of California, he allowed them to open all the churches, but they can't sing. It's illegal for them to sing. That's how you worship God, or one of the ways is through singing. And I thought, my gosh, well, I know a lot of people that's upset.
What's his reasoning for that?
Well, the way I get it, he figured if they're singing, they're spewing spores out in the air that might infect somebody. Well, if that's the case, I wouldn't go to church to start with if I was afraid of that. I'm not afraid of that. But that's the reasoning they give.
Okay.
So, all right. We better read some scripture here, hadn't we? Could I get someone to read 7:1 and 2, please? Oh, yeah.
And the man of Kirjath Jearim came and fetched up the ark of the Lord and brought it into the house of Abinadab in the hill and sanctified Eleazar his son to keep the ark of the Lord. And it came to pass while the ark abode in Kirjath Jearim that the time was long, for it was 20 years, and all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord.
Sorry about all the difficult names. There used to be a guy that went to the church over at Quincy. His name was Mark Jordan. And I would ask him to read. And he really come back at me one day, he says, how come you asked me to read all the stuff's got the tough names in it? And there is some tough names there. Okay, let's go over here and ask a question.
Hope of Israel has helped with that because
Oh, yeah.
Bonnie do a lot of Hebrew reading, so we know the pronunciations. That helps us a lot. I'm not saying they're perfect, but
Well,
they're close.
sometimes if I go around one that I cannot pronounce, I'll just say and that and go on,
Yeah.
because I just can't pronounce it. It says, what do we know about Samuel prior to this week's lesson?
He was anointed of God
Yes.
from the beginning, from
Yes.
before conception. He was anointed by God. He was a judge of Israel. He was also their mighty warrior for them because he was bold in his resistance to the Philistines.
His is kind of a unique story, really. His mother was barren. Her name was Hannah. And,
Oh, I'm thinking Samson.
pardon?
I'm thinking Samson. But he was still anointed. Everything I said is still
Yeah.
true. Yeah.
Yeah. He was a judge, and it says,
Last of the judges.
Yeah, he
too.
was.
Yes, the last.
He was the last.
Hannah said that if God would give her a son, she'd give him back to God when he was weaned, and she did. And Eli, the priest, raised him from a small boy and through there. It says Samuel was called by God to his special ministry, and that's in chapter 3. And actually, it's kind of an interesting story. They even think, or some of them do, see if I know where it was. It was over here. It says Samuel wrote several books of the Bible. Jewish tradition named him as the author of the book of Judges, and together with Gad and Nathan of the book of Samuel. Of course, he died in the first book. And that was kind of, how did he write the second book if he was gone? And it says the Talmud also claims that he wrote the book of Ruth. Of course, there's some debate on that. There always is. Authorship, time of the writing is what it says. They don't think it was him. This Jewish aspect really gives you a lot of information and insight on these. Let's see. What had happened to the Ark of the Covenant?
Being stolen. Taken.
The Philistines had defeated the Israelites and they took the Ark. Of course, about 9 months later, they sent it back because God put all kinds of plagues and everything else on them. And it was brought back to let's see. It says, when Eli learned that his sons had been killed and the ark departed, he fell from the place he was seated and died. It says in the Bible that he fell over backwards. He was a heavy man and broke his neck.
Yep.
And God had already warned him because he allowed his sons to be evil. Let's see, I wanted to try to find out. It says where that ark was left, but where it was left, the man that lived there, he prospered. He was
Yes.
an Israelite.
Yep.
Okay. Now, wait a minute, I don't want to get ahead of myself here. somebody to read 3 and 4. Thank you, Jordan.
And Samuel spake to all the house of Israel, saying, If ye do return unto the Lord with all your hearts, then put away the strange gods and Ashtaroth from among you, and turn your hearts unto the Lord, and serve him only, and he will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines. Then the children of Israel did put away Baalim and Ashtaroth, and serve the Lord only.
I guess they seen a lot of stuff happening to them, and that's the reason they cried out. They wanted to return to the Lord. Samuel told her, what did Samuel call upon the people of Israel to do?
To repent.
Yes. Yes. It says Samuel's message was fairly simple. If they truly wanted to return to the Lord, that meant the removal of strange gods among them. Strange gods mean foreign gods, that is, the deities of the nations around them that were a source of temptation. And what were the two well-known fertility cults at that time?
The two what?
Balaam and
Baal and Ashtaroth.
Yes.
Ashtaroth.
The way I understand it, let's see, I'll probably get ahead of myself here.
Baal was the male and Ashtaroth
Yes.
was the female.
Right. It says among the most popular false gods in the region were Balaam and Ashtaroth. While they were worshipped under various names with localized distinctions, they were the primary fertility gods of the region. Baal was the male god, and Ashtaroth his female counterpart. Ritual prostitution was often associated with their worship. It says, how did Israel show their repentance?
They put them away. They got rid of them.
Yes. You know, I remember a story about, and I think it was in one of the lessons that we read here, about Abraham and his father. His father had images, gods, set on a shelf. Well, somebody was cleaning them. It may have been Abraham, and he broke them. His father got real angry with him and said, why did you do that? And the gist of the whole story was Abraham come back at him and he said, well, they're not real gods anyway, so why do you keep them? His father didn't have an answer for that. Now, I don't know whether that's I don't never remember reading that in the Bible, but it was something that was in the Jewish aspect. It was kind of funny. Let's see.
A lot of times those things come from the Talmud.
Well, they do a lot of, there's that name I was wanting to read. Abinadab. That was the name of the person they took the ark to.
Yep.
And his son, Eleazar, was consecrated as the ark's caretaker. His business was to guard the ark not only from being seized by malicious Philistines, but from being touched by curious Israelites. And we know what happens to people who touch it. That's just not good at all. Okay, I'll go ahead and read this one here. It says, and Samuel said, gather all Israel to Mizpah, and I will pray for you unto the Lord. And they gathered together to Mizpah and drew water and poured it out before the Lord and fasted on that day and said, there, we have sinned against the Lord. And Samuel judged the children of Israel in Mizpah. And when the Philistines heard that the children of Israel were gathered together to Mizpah, the lord of the Philistines went up against Israel. The lords of the Philistines. When the children of Israel heard it, they were afraid of the Philistines. And the children of Israel said to Samuel, cease not to cry unto the Lord our God for us, that he will save us out of the hands of the Philistines. Okay. I need a pencil. Have we got one in here someplace? Well, that'll do.
It's,
Here you go.
Rope. I keep forgetting where I'm at. Thank you. That'll do. Okay. I told a young woman one time at Quincy, I said, if I don't keep things right, then I forget something. And I said, the only excuse I got is old age. She looked at me and says, oh, Denny, don't say that. She said, I do the same thing and I'm only 38. I kind of teased her about that a little bit. Okay, how did the Israelites, well, we got that. Where did Samuel have the people gather? And what was this place named, what does this place's name mean? Okay.
Mizpah and Lookout or Watchtower.
Mhm. They say it was probably a real high place, and that's the reason.
Makes sense.
Mizpah, I guess that's the way you pronounce it. There's two spellings here. There's one is M-I-Z-P-E-H and one is M-I-Z-P-A-H. It says the name simply means lookout or watchtower. Nobody knows where that's at today. Okay, and what does this, okay, we already got that. While Israel was gathering, what did the Philistines decide to do?
attack.
Yes. It kind of gives you the inclination that the Philistines thought they were gathering to attack them. Now, whether that's actually what happened or not, I don't know. I think the Philistines outnumbered the Israelis. It says here that when the Philistines heard that the Israelites had gathered at Mizpah, their leaders saw this as a serious challenge, no doubt thinking that Israel was gathering for battle. Apparently, the Philistines decided it was their advantage to attack first while the Israelites were still gathered at one location. Now, whether that's actual or not, I don't know, because it doesn't say anything about that in the Bible. Okay, it says, Samuel cried unto the Lord for Israel, and the Lord heard him. And as Samuel was offering up the burnt offerings, the Philistines drew near to battle against Israel. But the Lord thundered with a great thunder on that day upon the Philistines and discomforted them. Or discomfited them, I guess. And they were smitten before Israel. And the men of Israel went out of Mizpah and pursued the Philistines and smote them until they came under Bethkar. Then Samuel took a stone and set it between Mizpah and Shin, and called the name of it Ebenezer, saying, hitherto has the Lord helped us. Okay, what was the significance of the thunder?
Well, I would think that they would know it was God. It was coming from the heavens, so it was God. The Philistines knew of the God of Israel. I mean, and they knew that he was
Yes, they
real and powerful.
They knew that because of Samson.
And so, you know, when that, I mean, I guess if the thunder was, it would put a fear in this is
Yeah.
so bad. I mean, I'm thinking of how the dogs get afraid of thunder, and I'm thinking of the Philistines.
You know, when Karen and I was a young couple, we was living in Putnamville. And we was living in a mobile home. And I had an old coon dog. His name was Whitey. And the doghouse we had for him, it kind of got messed up. So I took a barrel, cut the end out of the barrel, stuffed it full of straw, and that was his doghouse. And I had him tied on a chain with a stake in the ground. Well, one night, I don't know, it must have been about 3 o'clock in the morning, there was a clap of thunder. And I think that's an understatement, saying it was a clap of thunder. Because Karen and I both landed on the floor.
Mhm.
And we kept hearing stuff hit the house. It was like it was raining, but you could tell it wasn't raining. Well, the next morning I went out to see what happened. Because it was dark, you know, when it happened. And I seen that Whitey was all right. And after I seen what the rest of it, I wondered how he was all right. But it took me half a day to figure out what that lightning hit. And the neighbor come over and he said, well, I can see what it hit. We had a line of trees right behind the house. One about midways, right on top of Whitey's doghouse. There was only about 10 foot of it still standing. And it took the whole top out of that tree. It had blowed stuff clean out in the national road. It was the dangest thing you ever seen. And I thought, how in the world did that dog survive that lightning flash? His house wasn't, I bet it wasn't 6 feet from the tree. You'd have thought that lightning would have come down there and killed him. The only thing I can figure is he had that chain around his neck and it went to a steel peg driven in the ground. Maybe it grounded it to where it didn't hurt him or something. But I'll bet you that he was scared, because he was a scared dog anyway. He was always scared of something. But that's the worst thunderclap and lightning that I ever heard or seen. Of course, I never seen it. If I'd have been out there and seen it, I might have dropped dead. But it blew the whole top out of that tree, and it wasn't no small tree. At the base, it was probably a good 20 inches through. It was a locust.
Big locust, isn't it?
Well, it just tore it all to pieces. Well, I better get on with it. It says, what was the outcome of the battle between the Israelites and the Philistines?
Well, God gave them the victory. So the Israelites won, and not only did they win, but they pursued them and they slew them to a certain point.
Well, it says in the Bible that after this happened, that it was a long time before the Philistines bothered them. So they must have given them a sound beating. Okay, we've got one more question here. It says, what was the significance of the name given to the memorial of Israel's victory? Ebenezer is the...
Well, it says, in here it says it means stone of help.
Mm-hmm. And if you remember, Come Thou Fount, that's a good song, it really is. It says in there, it names the Ebenezer. Also it says, here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I come. That's in the song, yeah, Come Thou Fount. It says a lot of people probably don't realize what Ebenezer means without the account of this. It says what we must realize is that the Lord is, and I'm reading the wrong sentence. It says what we must realize is that the Lord is with us. Having helped us in the past, He will do so in the future. To be sure, we may not always experience instant victory over our fears, foes and failures, but we can be certain that the forces of evil will one day be crushed. Thank God for that.
Well, I think that's what we're missing out on. That when he prayed, and God scared the people so bad that that's how we whipped them. It
We
didn't
did.
help. The
Yeah,
Lord had
because
a
they
hand in it.
outnumbered the Israelites by a sizable amount. But, you know, there's modern battles that's taken place that you know God was on the side of right because of the way it come out. And I think I've told you this before about the 6-day war with Israel, where I think it was about 100 and some Egyptian tanks surrendered to 5 Israeli tanks. And that's documented, that actually happened. And when they asked them, they said, why did you surrender? You had the superior force. He said, we didn't surrender to the Israeli tanks, we surrendered to all the giants standing behind them. That tells me that God was there. You know, that's all I need to know. And, but that's pretty miraculous, really. And he helps us probably more than we realize.
Every day.
It's easy to think, well, that's just the way it happened. But it's really not. It's really not just the way it happened. It says, God has prepared a plan that restores our broken fellowship with Him. Now, there's one in here. I read it. That one, she put in the, about that bench. She put that in the flyer. I remember reading that, but I don't remember where I read it at.
I'm really thankful for studies like this because it helps remind us that we really don't have to do anything except rely on God and call out to Him in our time of any time, and He's there.
Yes.
And even if the enemy seems to have the upper hand, then we can know that God is bigger than the enemy and He can take care of anything. And we really just need to submit to Him and obey Him and call on Him. I think that's part of humility is
Yeah.
relying on the Lord.
Yeah, we got to be humble. This is what I was looking for. I've already read it to you, but I'll read it again. It says, the nation that pulls away from God or outright rejects Him invites His wrath. Political leaders who treat God as though He is irrelevant or unfit for the public arena are putting themselves and the people they govern on a perilous road. This week we will see how a proper view of God can lead to national revival and prosperity. Now I know that this nation has got thousands, probably millions of Christians in it. And I'd say the most of them are devout people. They really believe in God and they're good people. But as a whole, our nation is kind of pulled away from God. You see it through abortion, you know, and there's other things, the gay movement, and well, I hope I don't step on no toes. The latest one is the Black Lives Matter deal. Now, I'm not saying black lives don't matter. Don't miss that. But if you know what's behind that, it has nothing to do with Black Lives Matter. And that's what that Catholic priest tried to tell them. And they crucified him. And what he tried to tell them was the Black Lives Matter movement is nothing more than a ploy to gain control. And they're doing it. They're doing it. And I don't know what that man that I did hear how his death took place, and if it took place that way, those police officers definitely needed discipline. If that's correct. You see, you don't know, like the one that was shot out in Missouri. What was that town? Over there on the west end of Missouri. I can't remember what it was. Well, see, the stories got out that that boy was unarmed. He was shot multiple times, and once right through the top of the head with his hands out. He was surrendering. He was shot once. That's all. He wasn't shot multiple times. He just got done robbing a place. Of course, the police officer didn't know that. But when he tried to take the police officer's gun, that's when the police officer shot him. And if you want to really get down to the brass tacks of it, what about the 4 white police officers that was killed in Indianapolis by black people? Didn't their lives matter? I don't want you to think that I'm against black people, because I am not. Some of my best friends are black people. I'm not. But this stuff that's going on right now has nothing to do with blacks.
Or race.
It's all a big ploy. And the American people needs to wake up and see some of this stuff instead of just accepting it, for the way it is and letting it go. And I probably overstepped my boundaries here. If I offended anyone, I'm